variation both synchronically and diachronically. He's interested in language complexity. A lot of his work has dealt with dialectology and geolinguistic variation. And more recently, he's been developing a method that he is called corpus-based dialectometry. And in fact, his most recent book was on the corpus-based dialectometrical study of British dialects. And in the book review that I wrote about it, I argued that it was an exemplary move forward for the study of dialectology. Corpus linguistics is kind of interesting to me because it's almost like, to invoke a Canadian metaphor that's often used to refer to the French and English-speaking communities in Canada, like two solitudes. So often people who are working in variationist analysis, who are working on smaller scale corpora, may be using some methodology that might be of interest to people working in corpus linguistics, where you're dealing with large scale corpora, and vice versa. So I think it's very fitting that Benedikt is one of our speakers, and I think that we as variationists might have a lot to learn from what he's going to tell us today. So the title of his talk is about corpus linguistics, variation, and the variationist method.
This one is.
Okay, so yeah. Hey. Great to be here. Thank you. If you have an electronic device on you, you can download the slides that I'm using today at this URL, www.bnszm.net/NWAV PDF. And I suppose I should begin with a disclosure. These days, I don't often refer to myself as a corpus linguist. Corpus linguist to me sounds as if I were primarily interested in corpora, which I'm really not. I'm primarily interested in language and language variation. It just so happens that corpus linguistics is the methodology that I use more often than not. To be sure, there are people for whom corpus linguistics is more than a methodology, but I'm not one of them. So, I don't know, referring to people like me, like as a corpus linguist is sort of like referring to people like you as sociolinguistic interview linguists, if I catch my drift. But that being said, I do believe that corpus linguistics is an exciting methodology, and I'm to chat a little bit about it today. Okay, so my overall point is going to be that because language variation and change work draws on collections of naturalistic speech, mostly, LVC analysis and analysts use the corpus linguistic method by definition. Conversely, there are many corpus analysts who use the variationist method without necessarily explicitly saying so. And these people engage in what I will call today corpus-based variationist linguistics, or CVL in short. And so my aim today is to discuss styles and practices and different emphases that set apart work in LVC from work in CVL, and to highlight cross-pollination potential. So in section 1, I'm going to try to locate LVC in the big scheme of things, in the big scheme of the empirical linguistic sciences. After that, I'm going to talk about 6 major differences between CVL and LVC. And then I'm moving on to highlight ways in which recent work in CVL may inspire work in Okay, LVC in the big picture. So on this slide, you find a number of standard textbook definitions of what a corpus is and what corpus linguistics is. So Kennedy, for example, writes that a corpus is a body of written text or transcribed speech which can serve as a basis for linguistic analysis. And McEnery et al. Say that a corpus can be defined as a body of naturally occurring. So it's clear that to the extent that LVC analysts draw on fully transcribed sociolinguistic interviews to study variation, they use corpora and thus the corpus linguistic method according to these definitions. So in the spirit of the set theoretic theme of this conference, I would like to argue that the variationist method is a proper subset of the corpus linguistic family of methods. So, against the backdrop of considerations like these, how does LVC relate to other empirical sciences? So I think it's uncontroversial that we all do empirical linguistics. Sure enough, not all empirical linguists draw on naturalistic production data, corpus data, to make claims about language, but many of them do, and so the subfield of empirical linguists who draw on corpora I refer to as corpus-based linguistics. Not all corpus-based linguists are interested in variation. For instance, there are corpus linguists who are interested in phraseology, multi-word expressions, collocations, discourse analysis, and so on and so forth. These people are not usually interested in variation, but there is an important subgroup in the corpus linguistic camp that is interested in variation, and again, these people I refer to as corpus-based variationist linguists, or CVL analysts for short. And their work is characterized by three properties. In my definition, first, there's an interest in alternate ways of saying the same thing. So CVL analysts set up variants and variables. Second, they offer accountable analyses. And third, they marshal rigorous quantitative methodologies to explore the conditioning of variation. Why do people make the linguistic choices that they make? Okay, and then I would like to offer that within this community, we find a sub-community, nice folks such as yourselves who attend annual NWAV conferences, language variation and change analysts, whose work is set apart from other work in CVL by a number of different styles, practices, and so on and so forth, which will take center stage in the next section. Notice that the size of the circles is not necessarily proportional to the relative importance of the fields. And note also that an argument could be made that the LVC circle should extend beyond the corpus-based linguistics circle to the extent that variationist sociolinguists draw on elicited data, to the extent that they do experiments. This sort of data does not come within the remit of corpus linguistics. But I think it is fair to say that for the most part, LVC analysts do analyze naturalistic interview data, for example. And so I think this way of looking at things is more, I find it aesthetically and morally more pleasing somehow. So I'll stick with that. And in the remainder of my presentation, I will focus on the relationship between CVL and LVC. So just to clarify, on this slide, you find research that does not come within the remit of CVL. Of course, empirical research that is not corpus-based experimental psycholinguistics, corpus-based research that is not interested in variation, for instance, research on multi-word expressions. And then there's also corpus-based research that is interested in variation in a broad sense, but that does not use the variationist method. For example, Douglas Biber's seminal 1988 study on variation across speech and writing is undoubtedly concerned with variation, but he doesn't set up variance and variables. He's interested in frequency variation. So that's something that does not fit the bill of today's presentation. By contrast, here you have a list of recent studies that do fit the bill. I hope I didn't forget any of my friends and colleagues. The point is there's quite a bit of work in CVL. Notice again that these are not necessarily card-carrying variationist sociolinguists. And as I said in the beginning, many of these people would also not dream of identifying themselves as corpus linguists. So you have here construction grammarians, cognitive linguists, historical linguists, psycholinguists. For instance, Florian Jäger's 2006 Stanford PhD dissertation is a superbly variationist exercise in psycholinguistics, really. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about differences between LVC and CVL. Again, my overall point is that there is a lot of overlap between corpus-based variationist linguistics and LVC, but this is not to deny that there are also differences, of course. And what follows is a rundown of the 6 most important differences from my point of view. Okay, first of all, in LVC work, we typically find a focus on demographic factors, constraints on variation, age, gender, and so on and so forth. CVL work, to the extent that CVL analysts are interested in sociolinguistic factors at all, seem to be more interested in macro-sociological drifts and phenomena, standardization, prescriptivism, colloquialization, and so on and so forth. To some extent, I think this difference is trivial because the sad fact is many publicly available off-the-shelf corpora lack speaker information. So there are many CVL analysts who would love to include demographic factors, but the data is simply not there. Okay, secondly, of course, there is a strong focus on phonetic variation in the LVC community. This bias is by no means exclusive. Consider early work by Weiner and Labov or work by Sally Tagliamonte, Shana Poplak, and collaborators. But I think it is undeniable that phonetic variation plays a big role, for example, at conferences like NWAV. CVL work, on the other hand, tends to prioritize morphological, syntactic, or lexical variation. Again, to some extent, the reason is trivial. Until very recently, phonetically transcribed public corpora were very rare. On the other hand, I note that LVC datasets tend to be smaller usually than CVL datasets, and we know that you need more material to study grammatical or lexical variation by comparison to phonetic variation. Third, LVC analysts tend to be interested in one specific text type or speech type, and that is vernacular speech, as manifested in sociolinguistic interviews. This sort of data is often enriched by data on style shifting, whereas CVL analysts are considerably less selective. In fact, many standard corpora sample multiple genres, and it is sort of a It's considered a good thing in corpus-based variationist linguistics if you include many different speech types, text types, and registers in your analysis. So for example, the International Corpus of English covers no fewer than 32 different text types: face-to-face conversation, legal cross-examination, and so on and so forth. Okay, as far as the study of language change is concerned, the apparent time construct is of course very popular in LVC. So often what you have is synchronic vernacular speech data, and so an apparent time analysis is all you can do. In CVL, on the other hand, we find a focus on changes in real time, and here people usually draw on increasingly massive historical corpora, sampling a variety of written text. Okay, theory. Most CVL practitioners will identify as usage-based linguists in the sense of this statement by Joan Bybee. Grammar is the cognitive organization of one's experience with language. Linguistic experience has an impact on representation. This statement is totally mainstream in corpus-based variationist linguistics. But I understand in variationist sociolinguistics, this quote is a bit more controversial. Okay, and then finally we have a number of cultural differences, the most important of which I think concerns the big role that fieldwork plays in LVC training and research. You know, you guys are trained to go out into the community, talk to people. You are a fun crowd. You know, being social is part of your job description. Whereas for many corpus linguists, the idea of having to go out there and talk to actual human beings is a bit scary. This is why they became corpus linguists, maybe in the first place. Okay, coding and annotation. LVC analysts are not afraid of meticulous manual data analysis, whereas CVL people are more enthusiastic about automatic and semi-automatic annotation techniques. Again, this also may have to do with the fact that CVL data sets are typically larger than LVC data sets. There are some trivial terminological differences, and also in the LVC community, we find a keen awareness of and insistence on foundational principles, such as the principle of accountability. Okay, cross-pollination potential. Historically speaking, it is, of course, work in LVC that has inspired much work in corpus-based variationist linguistics, and not the other way around. So I guess it's fair to ask how the favor can be returned and which recent advances in corpus-based variationist linguistics may be of interest to variationist sociolinguistics. And I think there are three fields that may be of interest to you guys. Multivariable studies and feature or variable aggregation. Second, research on register-induced variation and variation between registers. And third, probabilistic grammar studies. So let me talk about these fields in turn. Okay, the traditional way in which LVC research proceeds is it studies individual linguistic variables, one variable at a time. But recently, we see more interest in the joint behavior of variables. For example, Guy 2013 demonstrates that multiple variables do not always co-vary in the theoretically expected fashion, or that it is not that easy to demonstrate reasonable covariation behavior, and he calls for more work on this. The good news is that feature aggregation has been a theme in the corpus linguistic literature for a long while. It's basically, again, going back to Doug Byer's 1988 monograph. And so in corpus-based variationist linguistics, you'll find a rich toolbox of aggregational multivariable methodology. So let me just illustrate by citing two recent studies. One is a book that I published a couple of years ago entitled Grammatical Variation in British English Dialects. And in the book, I analyzed transcribed interviews sampled in the Freiburg corpus of English dialects. And the methodology I use is dialectometry as opposed to dialectology, which means that I'm interested not in individual linguistic features or variables, but in joint frequency variation of 57 morphosyntax features in 34 British English dialects. I should add that the study is not, strictly speaking, set up in terms of variance and variables, but I do take the liberty to mention it nonetheless because the methodology would work just as well with this other variationist sort of input. Okay, so this is a big picture map. I don't know if you can read it. So the map shows dialect locations that are overall similar in terms of grammatical variation patterns. So dialect locations that have similar color hues are linguistically similar, and locations that have different color hues are linguistically different. The map is based on all 57 features, and it turns out that there is a substantial north-south divide, which is not entirely unexpected given the literature. Now, the question is, do all 57 features actually pattern in this geolinguistic way, or are there certain feature bundles which are responsible for the north-south split we see here? To address this question, I use principal component analysis to identify regionally distinctive feature bundles, and it turns out that yes, there are particular feature bundles that are strongly implicated in this north-south split. So in the upper half of this table, you find features that are significantly more popular in the south of Britain than in the north. Things like non-standard verbal S, multiple negation, non-standard past tense come and done, and so on and so forth. But there are other features and feature bundles which do not take part in this north-south divide. So, for example, in this table, you find features which are distributed in a different way. For instance, the primary verb to do, think of periphrastic do, has a different geolinguistic distribution. So the message is not all features are equal, speaking. Okay, here's another study that I would like to mention. Hinrichs et al., a paper that is to appear in the December issue of Language. In the paper, we study relativization variation in standard English restrictive relative clauses. Tom saw the car that Mary had sold, which Mary had sold, Mary had sold. And the point of departure is that in written English, this variation is undergoing massive shift from which to that, spearheaded by American English. So that's been known for a while. The question is, why do we see the shift? And there are two competing explanations. One has to do with prescriptivism. Recent style guides have been advocating usage of that in restrictive relative clauses. This is a quote from Strunk and White. Careful writers go witch hunting. On the other hand, the dat shift could be an outgrowth of the colloquialization of the norms of written English. As we know that that is the informal and vernacular variant vis-a-vis more bookish witch. Okay, so which explanation is the correct one? To address this question, Hinrichs et al. Study a large number of tokens and annotate not only for classical language internal and language external factors, but also for additional variables regulated by prescriptivism, which they include as independent variables in regression analysis. Usage of passive voice, prepositions, joining, split infinitives, and so on. And the study then uses regression analysis to check the extent to which the above features predict relativizer choice, the hypothesis being that if the dat shift is a prescriptivism-driven change, then those writers who go witch hunting should also be those writers who avoid split infinitives, prepositions, joining, and so on and so forth. So it turns out that the variables co-vary in a systematic way, but the dominant logic is not one of prescriptivism or prescriptivist correctness, but informality. And so we argue that the dat shift is best referred to as institutionally bad colloquialization. Okay, so feature aggregation. So why is it a good idea to have feature aggregation? I think that single variable studies are fine if the focus is really on the features or the trees, but they are inadequate if it is multidimensional legs, the forests, or drifts such as colloquialization or standardization, which are of interest. And Nurbon 2009 offers a very nice discussion of this. And if you want to work in the forestry business, again, the good news is that aggregational methods are fairly well developed in the corpus-based literature. Okay, I turn to a second field that may be of interest to you guys. Can you all hear me, by the way? Is it okay? So I've said before that variationist sociolinguists tend to be interested in one particular text or speech type or register, which is vernacular speech. And of course, if you're interested in phonetic variation or in discourse grammar, you don't have much choice. You have to analyze informal spoken language. But if you're interested in grammar, morphology, lexical variation even, you do have a choice actually. You could also in theory study written language or more formal spoken text types. But I think it is fair to say that there is a sense in the variationist sociolinguistics community that vernacular speech is the register or style where variation is at its most interesting, right? So there's supposed to be more variation, richer variation, and variation that is less diluted or constrained by things like prescriptivism and so on. So many corpus linguists, I guess, would actually doubt that there is more variation in speech. And in any event, they would argue that this is a claim that must be demonstrated empirically as opposed to asserted priori, I suppose. And as a matter of fact, as I said before, there's a long-standing corpus linguistic interest in register differences, again, basically going back to Doug Biber's 1988 monograph. But I think that the difference that register makes, especially in a variationist choice-making perspective, is still under-researched, and there's a lot of work to do for people. you and me, I suppose. Okay, 2 studies to show how and why register variation, register-induced variation may be interesting. Rutte et al. Is a study that will appear shortly in the International Journal of Corpus Linguistics. And what we do is we study lexical variation in standard English and investigate the extent to which it is patterned in space, time, and across registers. We draw on semantic vector space modeling to create an unbiased lexical variable set comprising no fewer than 300 lexical variables: holiday, trip, sea, ocean, computer, PC, truck, lorry, and so on and so forth. And then we use aggregational techniques, so I could have mentioned this study in the previous section as well, to rank the lectal dimension in terms of how strongly they trigger variation. And the data source we draw on is the Brown family of corpora, a well-known corpus resource, which represents at least 3 lectal dimensions: real-time, 1960s versus 1990s, regional variation, American English versus British English, and there's also register variation in there because the corpora sample both informational registers, such as newspaper prose, and imaginative registers, such as fiction. So I just skipped the gory technicalities and tell you that the technique that we use, individual differences scaling, ranks the lectal dimensions as follows. The most important language external dimension is actually register variation, informational versus imaginative prose. Variety or regional variation comes in second, and real time is third. So register variation or register-induced variation is really, really important when it comes to lexical variation. Another study that I would like to mention here is Grafmiller 2014, which is about the extent to which the probabilistic grammar of genitive choice differs across genres or registers. So this is about variation between the S genitive in English, the Grizzlies winning streak, and the off genitive, as in the sidekick of Gene Autry. And Grafmiller fits a regression model, 9 predictors, on data drawn from 2 corpora, Switchboard and Brown, which represent between them 6 different registers and genres: conversation, general fiction, press, and so on and so forth. So these are the predictors or conditioning factors in LVC parlance that Grafmiller considers, things like possessor animacy, length, and so on and so forth. And it turns out that no fewer than 5 of these 9 predictors interact significantly with register, which is another way of saying that these predictors have different effect strengths in different registers. So the probabilistic grammar of genitive choice is massively sensitive to genre effects. And the study also shows that variation in written English is not any less interesting than variation in spontaneous spoken English. Okay, so as I said in the beginning, corpus linguists would argue that register is an extremely important language external determinant of variation, and that it is unwise to restrict attention to just one particular text type or speech type. And I would like to add that the plasticity of linguistic choice-making as a function of register remains comparatively under-researched, and it's a theoretically really interesting question. So how much probabilistic knowledge does it actually take to master text type variation in a literate language like English, where you have all these interaction effects between language internal constraints and I think this is a field where the comparative sociolinguistics method may actually find new, exciting applications. So the task would be not to compare community grammars or dialect grammars, but to compare register grammars, probabilistic register grammars, to learn more about family relationships between these registers and to understand which language internal constraints tend to be stable across registers and which ones tend to be variable. Okay, I move on to a third field that I would like to mention, probabilistic grammar studies. And I focus on a particular type of probabilistic grammar research, namely the variation-centered and to some extent usage-based framework developed by Joan Bresnan and collaborators. And I find this framework particularly interesting because it links up corpus-based research and to some extent experimental research to recent advances in linguistic theorizing. There are two crucial assumptions that fuel this work. The first one is that syntactic variation and change is subtle, gradient, and probabilistic rather than categorical in nature, and this is something I do not need to sell. Second assumption is that linguistic knowledge includes knowledge of probabilities and speakers have powerful predictive capacities. So how do we know that? What people working in this framework usually do is they do use the variationist method. So they're interested in semantically equivalent ways of saying the same thing. And so one important variable in this field is the dative alternation. Somebody once said, I don't remember whom, there are only three topics in English linguistics: synchronic linguistics, diachronic linguistics, and the dative alternation. So it's popular. Okay, so it's variation between the ditransitive dative, as in we sent the president a letter, and the prepositional dative variant, as in we sent a letter to the president. So that's a variable with two variants. And in an important 2007 paper, Bresnan et al. Show, based on really meticulous annotation and regression analysis based on corpus data, that there are no fewer than 10 constraints or conditioning factors that constrain this variation. They look at spoken American English as sampled in the switchboard corpus. This is the regression model that they published. And of course, regression models are nothing to write home about from NWAV conferences, because you guys have been in the regression business essentially since before I was born, I suppose, since the 1970s. But what's interesting here is the extent to which predictions by models like this one match with the intuitions that native speakers have about the naturalness of particular grammatical variants given the same context. And you can show this in experiments such as the 100 split task, in which participants rate the naturalness of alternative forms as continuations of a context by distributing 100 points between the alternatives. Thus, for example, participants might give pairs of values to the alternatives like 25 to 75, 0 to 100, so on and so forth. And from such values, one can determine whether the participants give responses in line with the probabilities given by the model, because that's basically what regression models do, right? They predict probabilities. They associate probabilities with particular syntactic variants given particular syntactic contexts. Okay, this is an actual example of an 100 split task. You give subjects some sort of authentic corpus context, such as this one, which is taken from the switchboard corpus. I'm in college, only 21, blah, 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 and they get the wrong medicine just because, you know, the AIDS or whatever. And then you offer subjects two continuations. either just give them the wrong medicine or give the wrong medicine to them. One of them is the variant that actually appeared in the corpus. Now, you can take a minute and distribute your 100 points. Which one is the more natural continuations, and how many points would it deserve to receive? It turns out that the regression model predicts a 98-2 split in favor of the ditransitive dative variant in 1. That's also the variant that actually occurred in the corpus. It's very likely because the recipient is pronominal, for example. The theme is comparatively long, so this is the probability that the model calculates. And it turns out that in experiments, speakers tend to agree with this sort of split. They will typically also give splits in the 90-10. So this goes to show that at some level, speakers have probabilistic knowledge and that they can make probabilistic predictions. So here's some interesting, I think, work that has come out of this tradition. Bresnan and Tate, 2008, a very well-known paper, I think, about probabilistic differences between US and New Zealand English. Demanev, 2012, about the development of probabilistic grammars in children. Walk et al. About the real-time dynamics of probabilistic change in the late modern English period. Grafmiller, 2014, that's a study we discussed in the previous section about register-induced variation. And Szmrecsanyi et al. To appear about the scope and limits of syntactic variation in varieties of English around the world. And since I have a few minutes, let me just talk a little bit about that last study. So it's the first results coming out of a project that we are in the process of conducting at the University of Leuven, and our main goal is to understand the plasticity of probabilistic knowledge of English grammar on the part of language users with diverse regional and cultural backgrounds. We study a number of variation phenomena, grammatical variation phenomena, including the particle placement, alternation, variation you find after English, transitive particle verbs, the split pattern, such as in 4a, the president looked the word up, where the direct object intervenes between verb and particle, and the unsplit pattern, as in the president looked up the word. So there are a number of well-known constraints on this variation. Among other things, weight of the direct object plays a role, thanks to the principle of end weight. People tend to place longer direct objects at the end of an utterance, and so when the direct object is long, the unsplit pattern should be preferred. And that's actually what we see in the data. So this diagram plots the probability of the split pattern, look the word up, against length in words of the direct object. So we see the expected negative relationship. So the longer the direct object, the less likely the split pattern becomes. But what's interesting is that we looked at different varieties of English, 4 different varieties of English in this case, and it turns out that L1, or speakers of L1 varieties of English, react more strongly to this particular constraint length. So they're more sensitive to it. The 2 upper curves are about Canadian English and British English. By contrast, the 2 L2 varieties that are represented in this diagram, Indian English and Singapore English, exhibit more level curves. So these speakers are less sensitive. For some reason, probably has to do with memory effects. So they're less sensitive to this constraint than L1 speakers. So that's very exciting. There seems to be a difference as regards knowledge or processing. And so the next step, of course, would be to recruit speakers of these varieties and to test in the lab if this difference materializes in experiments. Okay, so why is this line of research interesting, or why might it be interesting to you? First of all, probabilistic grammar research is hot. Again, you have been doing probabilistic research on probabilistic variation for a long time, but what sets apart this line of research from traditional LVC work is, I think, a key interest in what language users know about the effect of language internal constraints on grammatical variation. So the internal constraints really take center stage as opposed to other constraints. This work is methodologically highly compatible, and it sort of offers a balanced diet, in the words of Guy 2014, consisting of both abstract constraints, things like the principle of end weight, length, information status, plus usage and a healthy dose of experience. Because once you find probabilistic differences, say, between dialects or varieties, you usually look at usage and how speakers of these varieties have received different input during their lifetimes compared to other speakers. Okay, so a few brief concluding remarks. So, and I would like to end on an inclusive note, if I may. So I personally think that corpus-based variationist linguistics is entirely compatible with LVC to the extent that we do not insist that variationist work must necessarily consider demographic factors such as age, gender, and so on and so forth. So as long as we define our mission as understanding how the dynamics of variation work and why they work in the way that they work, I think we're all outlined a number of fields where I think LVC analysts may draw some inspiration from recent work in CDF. Thank you very much.
Thank you for interesting and hopefully cross-pollinating talk. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions? John?
Well, okay, can you hear me now? Benedikt, is it? register variation, vernacular. I think it's probably difficulties in both directions. I think most practicing variationists and sociolinguists in the last 20 years not paid that much attention to, quite apart from validity of the concept of the vernacular, not paid that much attention to register or stylistic. But I don't think it's so much a focus just on the variation. That's actually been relatively lacking within sociolinguistics. Argue that all you have to look at is any one of the charts, the tables, or Vibe or Trudgill right after, because, you know, whatever you call those, that range of things, the fact that you get this massive range, I guess that's I enjoyed the overall presentation on this. That issue of register variation.
So actually, I actually agree about the limited availability of good spoken corpora. So I would really like to encourage you, if you have material that you think could be made public, please go ahead and help us create good public spoken corpora. About the register variation issue, so when you talk about style shifting, it's really, it's partly based on elicited data, right? So word lists and so on and so forth, reading passages. So as I said in the beginning, that would not really come within the remit of corpus linguistics. So corpus-based people have tended to ignore that. It's important information and it's empirical, but it is not a thing that would come easy to corpus linguists to engage with intellectually. What I was referring to was more generally, for instance, that we should take maybe written language and variation between the written medium and the spoken medium more seriously, and that there's a lot of theoretical mileage to be had by also taking into consideration various written text types. Whereas the style shifting thing, it's really about elicited production in the spoken medium, right? So it's a bit different from what I tried to say. Does that make sense?
I've received orders that we should move on, but if anyone has one very quick question, we can take it. Sally, a question?
Comprehensive overview of what corpus linguistics does and how Benedikt you said it could. My comment about register media, I think, is extremely important because right now written registers are expanding massively, and it will be very interesting for us to tap in to those differences.
I agree.
Thanks for that, Sally. So in the interest of cross-pollination, maybe we can also cross-pollinate with hats in the future. So I'd like to present Benedikt with one of our lovely toques.
Thank you very much.
So if you could please move on very quickly to the next session, which starts at 10:10.
The debates room and the music room are on the second floor. There are also washrooms on the second floor and washrooms in the basement. The East Common Room is on the main floor, down the hall past registration. Thanks, everyone. Sorry about the technical difficulties.